Hey everybody, this is actually a new podcast for Fall 16. I want to talk about the significance of 1836. For many of us, maybe many of you, you might have had a really excellent Texas history teacher. My daughter actually has an excellent Texas history teacher now. But in popular memory, I think it's fair to say that 1836 is year zero in Texas history. It's when Texas becomes an independent nation. As I talked about in class on Tuesday, it's also when Anglos begin to dominate Texas culturally, politically, economically, in terms of law and the judiciary. Texas basically is run by white people after 1836, Anglo-Americans in particular. And I'll develop this, but I've already kind of introduced this idea. Tejanos, they had governed Texas, for 100 years since the founding of San Antonio in 1718. They're the big losers in this story. Very, very quickly, Tejanos will be driven out of East Texas, driven out of Austin. Many will be driven out of San Antonio, almost all the way to the border. What was called ethnic cleansing in the 1990s and some wars in the Balkans. So what you had is that, as my friend Raul Ramos at UH talks about in his book, Tejanos become a despised minority in Texas after 1836. The situation for African Americans or African Texans or Texans of African descent doesn't really change that much. They had come into Texas. Many of them had been designated as apprentices, but they'd always been slaves coming into Texas. Their treatment doesn't change. It's still horrific. It's still a system of labor built on violence, and I'll talk about it more over the course of the next couple of weeks. But if you're African American, you don't really notice a change in your situation with the Texas Revolution, with one very significant exception. You start having a tremendous growth in the African American population in Texas after 1836, because of course at that point there's no Mexican government to stop slaves from coming into Texas, and the Republic of Texas completely opens its doors to Anglo-Southerners coming into Texas with their slaves. And the vast majority of Americans who are coming into Texas after 1836 are folks who are coming into Texas from slave-holding states. Part of that is proximity. Texas is right next to Louisiana. It's close to Mississippi and Alabama, Arkansas as well. So Texas is very much surrounded, especially in the east and northeast, by slave territory. And the other thing is that East Texas, many of the folks that were coming into Texas wanted to become part of the global cotton economy. They wanted to come into Texas to grow cotton. And if you were going to grow cotton, it was inevitable that you were going to use slave labor. So Americans that did not want to get involved in that business would stay out of Texas for the most part, unless somehow they could take advantage of the business. So, for instance, you could be a merchant that was selling cotton in the East, where you don't have a plantation yourself, you don't maybe own slaves yourself, but you are dealing with cotton that is grown and cultivated by slaves. So in some sense your hands aren't dirty, but in a larger sense they are, because you're dealing in a commodity that's produced by slaves. So 1836, key moment, revolutionary moment in the history of Texas. Now, there's something else I want to talk about that has to do with the Chris book, and especially the so-called Pena Diary, which was an expose about Santa Anna and how his stupidity and how his ineptness, if ineptness is actually a word, but I think you know what I'm talking about, lost Texas to Mexico. That's why Pena is writing this diary. He's not trying to undermine a Davy Crockett myth. He doesn't really care about Davy Crockett one way or the other. In fact, he probably feels sorry for Davy Crockett. So that's the whole point of the Pena diary. So a student came up yesterday and asked me, well, why do people care? Why do people care about Davy Crockett? And I realized I really hadn't answered it in class. And here's the reason. And what happens is that the stories we tell about the past become very much caught up in our own identity and in how we think about ourselves. Okay, now it doesn't always happen this way. Maybe many of you didn't really care about Davy Crockett and you wonder what all the fuss is about. But for many Texans, especially Anglo-Texans, and perhaps maybe even of an older generation, the story of Davy Crockett was hugely important. It was a story that was about sacrifice, gallantry, really the willingness to die in the face of what was seen as oppression. And that's the story in its best sense. Like I said yesterday, or the day, I guess it was yesterday, this is Wednesday, what the story of the Alamo really was used for was to justify a racial hierarchy that put whites on top. But there is an element of it where folks are identifying with what they see as the courage of Davy Crockett and the sacrifice of Davy Crockett. And it becomes part of who they see as themselves. It becomes part of their personal identity. That if you admire Davy Crockett, if you think about Davy Crockett and the way that you believe that he acted at the Alamo, well, maybe this gives you a little bit more strength as you go through life. Maybe it provides a guiding principle to the way you approach life. And so what happens is, and you see this very, very often, personal identity can get merged into historical narratives. And this is another way that this idea that I'm trying to develop, kind of a meta idea that's beyond Texas history, this idea that you may not care about history, but history cares about you, which is absolutely 100% the truth, by the way. And so identity, personal identity, gets, in many cases, got caught up in the Davy Crockett story. And so this is why folks were upset and are still upset when someone comes along and says, no, Davy Crockett didn't die at the Alamo. He died the next day, and because that opens up all kinds of doors about, okay, if he didn't die on the day of the Alamo, March 6, 1836, why didn't he die? Did he fight? Was he the courageous, self-sacrificing Texas patriot that I was taught to believe in? And so if you put a little crack in the story, what happens is, often anyway, it becomes a threat to people's personal identity, because their personal identity has gotten merged into the story of Davy Crockett. And you see this often in history when people identify with the past. And usually it's a good thing, but if it's challenged, it can cause some discomfort. And it opens up all kinds of issues about, well, for instance, racial hierarchies, that kind of a thing. Left-wing academics are trying to undermine our heroes because they're trying to undermine our core values as a society. So this is why people, or at least some people, care about Davy Crockett. And this is why they fight so hard against Pena's account of how Davy Crockett died, that he was captured, surrendered, and ordered executed the next day. They don't take into account that Davy Crockett suffered tremendously. None of that. There's a need for them to think that he died that day, that he was so self-sacrificing. But here's the bigger issue, again, somewhat along the lines of you may not care about history, but history cares about you. is that often what you'll see when you question a historical figure or a historical incident, that people's identity has merged with the historical narrative. In some ways, they become one. And if you question the historical narrative, you start questioning, or people feel like you're questioning their identity, and it can make folks very, very uncomfortable. I'm sure you've all seen the movie A Few Good Men, or on cable. I mean, I know it came out a long time ago, but it seems to be one of those movies that resonates still. And there's the famous Jack Nicholson line, "You can't handle the truth." And that's true of a lot of history. History is often just told as a bedtime story to make people feel good about their past, and make people feel good about Texas or the United States. And I love Texas. I'm a very proud Texan. I love the United States. But our history is much, much more complicated and gnarly, to say the least, than the bedtime stories would have you believe. And when you kind of push at that, it can make some folks uncomfortable because you're challenging their identity.